Welcome to our application tips webinar. I'm Brett Twitty, Director of Admissions for the Executive Format. So excited to see so many of you here taking time out of your Wednesday afternoon to learn a little bit more about our application process and hear a few tips. So first of all, congratulations on taking this next step in your MBA journey, and look forward to answering your questions over the next 30 minutes or so. Feel free to type questions in the chat box. As we move along, I'll answer them. Just a quick overview here over what I'll cover in the next 30 minutes. As you'll see, application materials, frequent questions, and your questions. So that's also another opportunity for you to raise any sort of last things that are on your mind. As a quick reminder, our next deadline is March 10, followed by April 10. I imagine many of you just looking at some of the names here on the screen are working on an application for our March 10th deadline. So our application requirements, this should be, for those of you who have opened up our application and spent a little bit of time on our website, this should be pretty much a reminder for you. But for those of you who are less familiar, just starting your research process, our application fee, essay standardized test score or valid test waiver. If you've spent some time on our admissions FAQ page or on our application itself, you'll note that we do have a waiver process, and I'll get into a little bit more about that later. We do require transcripts, but it's important to note that for the purposes of our application, they do not have to be official transcripts. We will accept unofficial transcripts in the application process. If you are admitted and decide to matriculate at Darden, then you would need to submit an official transcript. What's an unofficial transcript? A good example would be a PDF of your transcript that is issued directly to you. What is an official transcript? That is a transcript that is sent directly from your degree granting institution to our office. So not issued to you is an easy way to think about that. And of course, we do require transcripts for all degree-related coursework in our application process. 2 recommendations. I'll get more into exactly what the recommendations entail, but we do require 2. You are potentially able to submit a 3rd, but really 2 is all that we need. And a company support letter. I'll detail this a little bit later in the presentation, but while it's listed here as an application material, it's not technically required for our application. If you are unable to get your company support letter in time for our application process, if you're admitted to Darden, it's something that you would then be required to submit prior to matriculation. All right. So frequent questions, and some of these may look a little bit familiar to you, to those of you who've gotten a few of our application-related emails. But just wanted to raise them here in the event that they kind of align with some things that have been on your mind, or raise other questions that you might have. So I don't have my company support letter. Can I still apply? As I mentioned, the company support letter, while technically an admissions application requirement, is not really. It is something that we at least need to have in hand prior to your matriculation at Darden if you are admitted and choose to accept our offer, but we don't technically need it in the admissions process. So the things that typically take the most time for people to get together are letters of recommendation and company support letter. So this may make March seem a little bit more feasible for you as a deadline if you haven't had a chance to get that company support letter. And of course, by company support, just to be very clear what we're talking about, we mean support in terms of time. So there's some examples on our website, but typically the letter reads something like this, and it comes from your supervisor most often. So your supervisor would say, I've reviewed the requirements for the program, the time commitment necessary, and I authorize this applicant to take the time necessary to participate in the program. It could also speak potentially to financial support, but really all we're looking for in the company support letter is support in terms of time. So the other very common question that I get at this time of year as people are sort of rushing to get their application together, and again, this is sort of related to these time-intensive parts of your application. I only have one letter of recommendation. Can I still apply this round? The answer is yes, and hopefully what you'll start to realize as we get into these questions is that our orientation as an admissions committee, particularly with our exec candidates, is if we can include you in a round, we want to include you in a round, because that will mean you'll get a decision at least a full month earlier than you would have by waiting for a subsequent round. So this is how it works if you only have one letter of recommendation. So as long as we have one letter of recommendation in hand at the time of the application deadline, we can begin to move you forward in the review process. We will require 2 recommendations to ultimately render a final decision, so that at least creates a little bit more time for you to get that second recommendation in. If you've spent some time on our deadlines page, you'll note that we sequence out each round. We have our deadline, we have our target interview dates, and then we have a decision release date. So your window to submit that second recommendation would be from the deadline to at least a few days, typically at least 3 to 4 days before your decision release date. And so for March 10, a good example, the decision release date is March 30th. So as long as we had your second letter in hand by the 26th or 27th, we could still release your decision on time for that March 30 date. So hopefully that makes some sense. Sometimes people will ask a question, well, I'm still waiting on one letter of recommendation. I'm still waiting on both letters of recommendation. Can I go ahead and submit my application? And the answer is yes. If you finished all of your portions of the application, go ahead and submit your application. Your letters of recommendation will automatically associate with your application as they are received. So that's a seamless process that just happens in the background in our system. So another common question that I receive around this time of a year as the deadlines start to become fewer and fewer and people are sort of rushing to finish their application is, I have scheduled to take my standardized test after the deadline. Can I still apply in this round? The answer is yes. So what you will do is in your application, you will note your future test date. So if you're taking GMAT, GRE, executive assessment, you would just indicate the date on which you plan to take the test. And then you would send us your unofficial scores as soon as you have them after taking the test. For those of you who are familiar with taking, say, the EA or the GMAT, you know that you get an unofficial score report immediately upon taking the test. Then an official score report is sent to our school. So you would want to make sure that the official score report would also be sent to Darden. And again, it works very similarly to what I talked about with the second letter of recommendation. So as long as you note that future test date in your application and that test date occurs at least 3 or 4 days prior to our decision release date, we can still include you in a round. So, March 10th deadline, as long as we have your score, your test score in hand by the 26th or 27th, we can still include you and keep you on time for that March 30 decision release. So I need a few more days to finalize my application. Hopefully all of you, if you're working on an application for our March 10 deadline, you have received an email from me in the past couple days. Hey, I know you're working on an application, just checking in. Please let me know if I can help in any way. If you have questions, if we can be of assistance, certainly follow up. If you need more time, just let us know. We typically do have a little bit of flexibility. One of the challenges is that while we do have a little bit of flexibility, things move very quickly. It's about 3 weeks from the deadline to the actual decision release, as I mentioned previously. So we don't have weeks and weeks here, but we will have potentially 3 or 4 days, and can be a little bit flexible. And the nice thing about the 10th is that it actually falls on a Saturday. So if you needed an additional day or two, that's really no problem at all. So keep us posted. I think we just prefer that you let us know if you're in progress or you're trying to get your application together and you really want to be included in this round, that you let us know and that you keep us posted as you sort of work through your application. Obviously, again, we want to try to include you in this round if we can, and we view this very much as a partnership. So reach out, let us know how we can be of assistance. So continuing with the frequent questions, we have been through 4 rounds at this point. We had an October round, a November round, January round, and we just released decisions for our February round. And so March will be our 5th round. So we are now officially over halfway through our cycle. And so the question that people will typically ask me on the phone and via email is, okay, how does the scholarship process work? Do you even have scholarships? And if so, is there still scholarship money available? So it's a very simple process here at DARA, no additional paperwork. If you're admitted, you're automatically considered for a scholarship. Our scholarships are merit-based, which means they're primarily based off of indices of academic merit, at least as an initial threshold consideration. So that would be undergraduate GPA, graduate GPA, if applicable, standardized test score, professional certifications. So if you've applied, and you're being considered for a scholarship, to qualify for a merit scholarship, you at least have to check one of those boxes: strong undergraduate GPA, for example, or strong test score, or professional certification, something like CPA, CFA, and then additional factors can be considered. But our scholarships are first and foremost academic merit scholarships, so you do have to meet that initial threshold consideration. Our scholarship values range from $10,000 to $40,000 total. Our average award is around $15,000 to $20,000 total. And so, if you're curious about how that actually intersects with tuition and billing here at Darden, so there are 5 billing dates in the executive formats. So let's imagine you received a $20,000 scholarship. Your tuition would be discounted by $4,000 at each billing date. So $20,000 divided by 5, that's how your scholarship would work over the entirety of the program. Of course, if you have more detailed questions about our scholarship process, I'm always happy to help. Feel free to write in the chat box here, or send me an email as a follow-up. So oftentimes candidates will ask about who they should choose for their recommenders. It's worth noting what questions we ask in our recommendation materials. First and foremost, there's a ratings grid where your recommenders are asked to assess you on a few different dimensions. And then there are 3 question prompts. 1, how do you know the applicant? 2, how does the applicant rate relative to his or her peers? And then 3, what sort of feedback have you provided the applicant with? If you think about those questions, it can be really difficult for a colleague or a peer to answer some of those questions in a meaningful way, at least in a way that's helpful to our committee. So this is why we strongly prefer supervisors. People who have actually provided you with feedback, would have that sort of supervisory view on how you relate to your peers. And so hopefully that aligns with how you're thinking about your recommendations. What I find typically is that candidates have really individualized questions when it comes to recommendations. So we can make sort of overarching recommendations. So we can say, hey, we would like to see supervisors. Recency is better than primacy. So just because someone managed you 10 years ago for a period of 5 years, that may not necessarily be the best recommender, because we're trying to get a sense of who you are right now as someone who is about to matriculate in this program. But everybody's situation is a little bit different. I will say, if you are applying and you do not ask your current supervisor to write a letter of recommendation, that's something you want to explain in the additional comments section. As you know, our program is for our people who continue to work while they're in the program. And if you haven't had the conversation with your current supervisor about your decision to go back to school, haven't really raised that question yet, and you don't feel comfortable approaching him or her about writing a letter of recommendation, that's something you will want to share with our admissions committee in your application itself, just to give us a heads up as to why you chose not to ask your current supervisor to write a letter of recommendation. Hopefully that makes some sense. But of course, if you have any additional questions, any more personal specific questions about letters of recommendation, let us know. So this next question is a little bit about our standardized test requirement. We accept 3 standardized tests, and I always stress that it is a standardized test requirement. It is not a GMAT requirement, as oftentimes it will be phrased. We accept the executive assessment, the GMAT, and the GRE. Of the 3 tests that are listed here, you're probably less familiar with the executive assessment. It is a test that's about 3 years old at this point, but one of the nice things about it is that it's designed expressly for people like you, folks who are applying to an executive MBA program. It's a 40-question, 90-minute test. On average, students study, or test takers study, for about 20 hours for the test. Some will study as few as 10 hours, but most spend about 20 hours. And at this point, we have enough experience with it to say, this is kind of the range that we see, which is typically scores are in the 140s to 160s here at Darden. The most competitive scores, and again, we're just talking about pure numbers here. Obviously, the admissions process is very holistic in nature. But from an EA test taker standpoint, the most competitive scores that we see are in the 150s and 160s. So if you're planning to take the EA, keep that in the back of your mind, but also know that when we get that test score information, we're going to look at that information in the context of your broader application. So it's not just going to be undergraduate GPA or graduate GPA and test score alone. It's going to be the whole thing, plus an interview. Obviously, we do have a required interview for any candidate we are contemplating extending an offer of admission to. And so that's another additional opportunity for us to get to know you and learn about your story and background. So answered my other question. I've led these application tips webinars a couple months now, so I think I'm getting a little bit better here. The EA score range, I will say for the past two classes, I think we've seen pretty consistent scores, and we're always happy to help a student as you're researching the EA and you're learning about it. Think through the decision to take the EA versus the GMAT. The only wrinkle I will share that is something to think about depending upon what your career aspirations are post MBA experience. So if you are potentially interested in an entry-level MBA job for a top consulting firm, this is your McKinsey, Bain, BCG of the world. For entry-level positions, at least, not experienced hires, but entry-level positions, they will ask for a GMAT score. So if that sounds like you and it sounds like your potential career aspirations, follow up with us, and we can talk a little bit more about your potential fit for that kind of role and whether or not the GMAT makes sense. So I throw that in there as a little bit of a caveat. But our recommendation for most candidates applying to our executive MBA program who do not otherwise qualify for a test waiver would be to take the executive assessment. So this other one is specific to international applicants. If this describes you, we occasionally get this question: I'm an international applicant, do I need to submit proof of English proficiency? The answer is maybe. If English was not the language of instruction in your prior educational experience, the answer is yes. If you've done a subsequent graduate program where English was a language of instruction, but it was not the language of instruction in your undergraduate program, the answer is that it's strongly recommended. And if English was a language of instruction for all of your educational career, at least your undergraduate or graduate, then you do not need to submit proof of English proficiency. So upcoming deadlines, February is passed, so now we are on to March 10, April 10, May 10, June 10, and you'll note an asterisk there beside June 25th. June 25th is obviously very, very late in our cycle. We are a school with one start date. That start date is in mid-August, and so June 25th is there in the event that we still have space left in our class. So if you're sitting here and you're thinking about our March 10 deadline, that's a great deadline. We still have plenty of room in both locations, both Charlottesville and Roslyn. We still have scholarship money available. That will continue to be the case for April as well. By the time we get to May, if last year is any guide, things will start to tighten up a little bit. Last year, Roslyn filled up a little bit more quickly than Charlottesville. Typically, by the time we get to May, we'll have to start making some tougher calls regarding scholarship. There will still be some scholarship money available, but hopefully you're getting the sense that things become just a little bit more complicated by the time we get to May. The same could be said for June. Our classes really started to take shape at that point. We've extended a number of offers at that point. So people have accepted those offers. So a significant portion of our scholarship budget will be committed. So we'll just be more limited in terms of what we can offer. So as an applicant, one of the things that you want to think about is, how focused are you on a particular location or a particular format, or how important are things like scholarship to you as you think about when to apply. If you are someone who is really focused on our Roslyn section, or you're someone for whom a scholarship award could have a significant impact on your decision, which is honestly the case for many students, consider applying by our April 10 deadline. Potentially our May 10 deadline too, but our general advice is to apply as early as you feel like you can put together a strong application. So both on these webinars and on the phone calls and various ways that we connect with students, we've been encouraging candidates to try to apply by April 10 if you can. So hopefully that makes some sense. But if you have specific questions about your timing and you're contemplating a May or June deadline, let us know. We're always happy to keep you posted and provide guidance as we go through these next few rounds. Last year is not perfectly predictive of this year. Every admission cycle has its own life and its sort of own organic quality. And so we're happy to continue to keep you posted if you are planning on a later round. All right, so a few more tips here. And these are ones that have just sort of come up from conversations that I've had both on these webinars, but also with applicants generally. One of the more underutilized sections of the application, I think it's because it is called additional comments. And sometimes candidates will look at it and say, well, I just put a lot of information in this application. I don't really have anything additional to say. But this can be a great place to include some thoughts about why you're really interested in Darden. It could be an opportunity for you to highlight a few things that you think you would like the committee to take particular note of. It's an opportunity for you to give us some context about an undergraduate experience you had or a graduate experience you had. Explain GPA, test score experience, information that's in your application. There's so much that can be done with this portion of the application. It is really blank space. And just a lot of potential there. So I would encourage you to think about using it as an additional opportunity to fill out your application. One of the things that you probably want to think about before you press submit is to take a step back from your application and think about the full story that you're telling, both career-wise, professionally, and also personally. So if you think about that narrative and you think about the story that you're telling, where is a gap that you can address, or anything that you can speak to that you think will help strengthen your application? That's a great opportunity for the additional comment section, and really, honestly, why it's there. Stay in touch with your recommenders. As I mentioned, the two parts of the application, again, a little nuance to this, but the slowest parts of our application are typically company support letter, and the recommendations. The recommendations, you can tell people, deadline's March 10, and they may submit right on March 10. People tend to be pretty deadline oriented. So you will be able to track in our system where your recommenders are, have they submitted or have they not. It's really pretty binary, but nevertheless, you can get a sense of whether they're making progress. Have they done it or not? And I would encourage you to stay engaged with that and to check in with them from time to time and see if they have any information. Obviously, you want to make sure the way that this works is once you put their email into the system, they get an automatic ping and they get a link to the recommendation materials. And you want to make sure that they actually got the link. Occasionally for military or government addresses, as well as folks who work for some consulting firms, they may not receive that email, or it may go to spam, junk. So you want to check back in just to make sure that they got everything. If they did not receive the recommendation link, let us know as soon as possible, and I can resend it either to a personal, or we can resend it to either a personal email address, or we can try resending it to the email address you entered previously. So I just mentioned that as sort of additional context for those of you who are still in process with your recommendation. So be sure to check out our video blogs. We also have a number of videos about the application process, but also the interview process. If you're invited for an interview, know that it's going to be more of a conversation than a behavioral interview. One of the things that may be a little bit different for you is that it's really probably going to be a lot of you talking about yourself, which may not be totally comfortable, but it's something that you can prepare for and you can be ready for. So think about answering these questions and doing so in about 30 minutes. So most of our interviewers, they will want to know your background, biographical details, where you're from, that sort of thing, educational experiences thus far, what you've done professionally, why you want to get an MBA, why you want to come to Darden, and what your career goals are, both short-term and long-term post-MBA. In addition, they may ask about hobbies, interests, other things that you're really passionate about, community involvement, leadership experiences, management experiences that you had. And you won't have a tremendous amount of time. 30 minutes really does fly by. So make sure you've done some practicing and preparation. It really will make a big difference. And of course, your interviewer will then type up the conversation. And that review will become part of your application materials and what our committee reviews when considering your overall packet. So you really, really want to make sure that you're telling as comprehensive a story, but also as good and presenting as good of an interview as possible. So there's a lot of videos you can watch, and I strongly recommend you check that one out. And then last, continue to learn about Darden. There's a lot of different ways to do this: class visit, office hours, schedule a conversation. We really enjoy getting to know candidates through this process, and we like to have multiple interactions if possible. Our program is a relatively small program. We have about 65 students in Charlottesville, 65 students in Roslyn, or so. We have 130, 135 students in the entire program per class. And so it's small, it's intimate. We really like to get to know people through the application process, and we hope you'll take us up on that opportunity. We will have class visits in Roslyn in March and April. And if you're interested in Charlottesville, class visits will resume in Charlottesville in May. So, and we also have visits in Roslyn in May as well. So, in fact, if you want to sit in on a class, there are opportunities to do that this weekend, this Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So check out our website for additional information. So I see we've got some questions here from Tom. No word limit for the job description section. Can you provide a rough estimate on what would be too long? I think it's a good question, a little challenging to answer in the abstract. I always encourage candidates to keep in mind that we're reading your application and a lot of applications at the same time. So some detail is good. You'll also have your resume there that will be attached to your application. These two pieces work in simultaneously, sort of together in concert. So your resume can give additional detail about accomplishments and achievements and management leadership that you had during that particular role. So most people write about a paragraph or so for their job description. Very high level overview of what they've done, who they manage, their basic responsibilities, and then the resume can provide additional details. So think about those two pieces of your application working together. So in addition, leave a little bit more time here for the questions that you might have. I'll give you a little bit more time to type them in the chat box. Thanks, Tom, for your question, and nice to see you online today. I will revisit something that I referred to here as we were getting started, but didn't actually fully explore. So I mentioned that we have a test waiver process. We do require a standardized test, either EA, GMAT, or GRE as part of our application process, but we do have a few limited instances in which we grant waivers. And so I'll sort of detail these instances for you here. So one would be if you have a master's degree in a quantitative or analytical discipline. A second example would be if you have a professional certification in a quantitative or technical discipline. So CPA, CFA are two really good examples of that. And then last but not least, I will note that we will accept an older or expired graduate level test score. So that would be GMAT, GRE. We will accept an LSAT or MCAT score. What we ask is if you happen to fall into MCAT, LSAT, older GMAT, GRE, if you're in that category, let us know, reach out so that we can talk with you a little bit about that and sort of counsel you regarding next steps. The way that the waiver process works is it's not a phone call or an email. We actually have a formalized process that you follow. There's a form that's linked from our application as well as from the admissions FAQ on our website. And you will attach your unofficial transcripts, a resume, and write a short statement as highlighting aspects of your background that you think are relevant for the consideration of your waiver request. And so it's relatively quick process. It takes maybe 2 to 3 days for us to review it, and we get back to you. And as mentioned previously, our basic recommendation, if you do not qualify for a waiver, if you go through that process and you don't qualify for a waiver, we generally recommend that you take the executive assessment. Sometimes candidates are like, gosh, is there any drawback to requesting the waiver? There's not. It doesn't hurt your candidacy in any way. And I understand, you might want to start there just to have a little bit of clarity as to whether you should take or whether you have to take a standardized test or not. So no problem with starting there, and then we can make a recommendation. We understand that programs do differ in terms of admissions requirements. So other schools to which you may be applying, or at least considering applying, may not require a standardized test. So we're happy to begin with that standardized test waiver and then make recommendations from there. All right. Well, I'll give you maybe another minute or so to type any questions. Realize this is a lot of information coming at you here in a relatively quick succession. As I mentioned, it's great to see so many of you online here today, and look forward to staying in touch. I'm happy to continue to be a resource for you over the next few days, for those of you who are working on a March 10 deadline application. And of course, for those of you who are targeting a later deadline, no problem at all. I'm still here to help. And so here are a few FAQs that are helpful that we put together. Obviously, the top one is purely admissions related. Program structure design, there is some complexity to how our program works. So I strongly encourage you to take a pass through that FAQ. We put it together. It's largely the product of a lot of questions that we've gotten from students over the past couple years, and built it out in a way that hopefully is pretty conversational and easy to follow. And then the last link there is about financial aid, some additional context on the scholarship information that I shared here today. And then next steps, as I mentioned, we really enjoy getting to know candidates through this process. Some of you, I recognize some of these names. We've had conversations, we've interacted some. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet or have a conversation with, I hope you will take us up on at least one of these, if not more. So we have class visits, as I mentioned, class visits in Roslyn this weekend, and then again in early April. Number of office hour meetings up and down the East Coast. Just got back from Philadelphia last week, and we'll be heading to New York next week. So if you happen to be in New York City, I will be there on Wednesday and Thursday of next week. And then last but not least, probably the most convenient option here, a phone conversation. So if some of what I shared today sort of spurred questions about the application process, or specific questions you might have about Darden, schedule a phone conversation. Easy to do from our website. Just go to the link here, pick a time that works with your schedule, and happy to help in any way that I can. So again, thank you for your time today. Best of luck as you finalize your application materials, and thank you for taking time to learn more about our application process.